The title of the session was Teacher Language Awareness. And this has a lot of different components. And I think this is really important for teachers to think about when they're looking at their content, how they're going to make it comprehensible for ELs, to think about all of these different factors. And this is something that as teachers, we just do this automatically, but I think it's good to point it out. I want you to become aware of these different things and have that in your brain as you're looking over your materials to make modifications for ELs. So teacher language awareness is language awareness is the main idea. And that is what you know about language. And if you add the teacher on the teacher language awareness, that's what does the teacher know about language and the pedagogical practice that you need to provide the instruction for that. But also part of the work that we do as teachers is our content knowledge. So that is, what do we know about the subject that we're actually teaching? And the next part of that is pedagogical knowledge or pedagogical content knowledge. How do we teach the subject that we're teaching? So we have to know about the subject and we have to know how to teach it before we can be effective. And then we also need to know pedagogical language knowledge. So we need to know the language specific to our subject in order to teach it. So the language that we need to use to teach science is different from the language that we use to teach English. And these are just important distinctions that I want to draw your attention to and to help make you more aware of. And disciplinary literacy is something that I think we take for granted sometimes as teachers. We are experts in our field, and especially in elementary, you have to be an expert in every field because you're teaching every subject. And so what disciplinary literacy is, it's the different unique uses of literacy for each subject area. They're each different. So you have different artifacts that you use for that. You have different ways to communicate. You have different ways of evaluating information, and you have different language that is expected for you to use. So each subject has different discourse or ways that we structure and use language that are very specific to that content. And this is what is really difficult for our ELs, is getting them access to this different discourse. But I think it's also important to remind ourselves as teachers that there are these differences in the way we use language in the different content areas. And it's important to become aware of that ourselves so that we can help our ELs better access the content. So one of the things that makes instructing ELs so difficult is this concept of academic vocabulary. There's two different types of vocabulary that Jim Cummins defined back in 1979 that we still use today, and that's BICS and CALP. So BICS is basic interpersonal communication skills. That is the skills that the kids use to talk to their buddies on the playground or talk to their friends in the cafeteria, or to have a little conversation with you. What did you do on the weekend? Do you need any help with anything? Or, are you having fun? It takes about 2 years for kids to become really proficient in that. And we get a lot of comments as the ESL teachers from teachers, well, I hear them talking just fine with their friends in the cafeteria. I don't know why they can't participate in my English discussion. So it's a misunderstanding that just because you have these basic interpersonal communication skills doesn't mean that you have this cognitive academic language proficiency, which is the CALP. It takes 5 to 7 years to acquire. So it's a much more lengthy process, and it also is content specific, right? So there's general academic language, and then there's the academic language that's specific to each different content area. And that's more typical of reading and writing. The BICS is more speaking and listening. And so those are the ones that our kids pick up on quicker, and then the academic piece takes a little bit longer. And so why is academic language so difficult? And this is a great article, and the citation is at the end of the presentation for you guys. These are the things that make academic language more difficult than everyday language. The Latin and Greek vocabulary. So for our Spanish-speaking students who are literate in Spanish, that's kind of helpful because there's a lot of cognates involved in academic language that come from Latin. but only if they're proficient in the academic language of Spanish, right? A lot of our kids come in and they're fluent in Spanish. They speak Spanish at home, in their church, in their community, but they've never gone to school in a Spanish-speaking country, so they don't have that academic Spanish. So we can't just assume that because they speak Spanish, they're going to understand all these Latin words. It doesn't always equate, but it can make it easier. Another thing that makes academic vocabulary so difficult is the morphologically complex words, and we're going to take a closer look at that in just a second. But what that is a lot of our words in English have a root word, and then depending on the prefixes or suffixes that you tack on, it can go from being a verb to a noun to an adjective to an adverb. And for someone who doesn't speak English, they might know the word international, or they might know the word national or nation, but then when you add the AL onto national, they don't realize it's become an adjective. They might think it's a completely different word. Whereas for English speakers, we know, it still has something to do with the same word, it just has changed it a little. But if you don't understand that about English, then you don't understand that it's the same word or similar word that has very similar meanings. Another thing that is very difficult about academic language is the content of lots of nouns, adjectives, and prepositions. And that sounds really bizarre, but we're going to look at an example on the next slide that will completely blow your mind, because it blew my mind when I first read it in this article. Another thing that's difficult about English is our grammatical metaphor, including nominalizations. And what that is taking a verb and making it into a noun, right? So sing is a verb, but singing is a noun. So how did something go from being a verb to a noun? And how did that adding that ing on the end make it into a completely different function in the sentence? So this is very difficult, and in academic language we use that a lot because we make these gerunds and these participial phrases that function as adjectives in a sentence when it's really a verb. How is it an adjective all of a sudden? So another thing is the informational density. In academic language, we have to squeeze a bunch of stuff in a very few words. So it's very dense. And if you don't understand one of those words, that could completely destroy your understanding of the sentence. And I have an activity to check out that later as well. And of course, the abstractness. A lot of the things that we talk about in academic language are abstract, and so they're very hard to get the meaning across to our ELs who might not have that background knowledge. They don't even know what the word means to begin with, so it's very hard to get them to be able to understand it in its abstract form. So this is our example. These are two different sentences. Which one do you think is easier and which one do you think is harder? All right, so let's look at an analysis of both of these sentences. Just to let you know, they're the same sentence, just written differently, slightly differently. So the one on the left has 22 words. It has 5 clauses in it, and there's 4.4 words per clause. If we look at the other one, it only has 15 words. There's only 1 clause, and there's 15 words per clause. So the next thing is this. So this one is more typical of oral language that we use on the playground with our friends. And this one is more typical of written academic language. So jamming a bunch of information into one complete thought. This one has 8 content words. And so this is the lexical density. So the higher the density, the more complex the language is. This one has 6 nouns, 2 prepositions, an adjective plus 1 noun functioning as an adjective, and a gerund, the gerund reading, and the phrase reading ability. So if you notice, this just has a bunch of words, but this one has 6 nouns. So as I mentioned before, one of the things that makes academic language so difficult is the high content of nouns and prepositions and adjectives, whereas this one doesn't really have that. This has Germanic vocabulary, so vocabulary that comes from German words, so more, can, make, mean. More complex vocabulary comes from Latinate vocabulary, amount. So if you look here, more goes to amount in the more difficult text. Can goes to ability in the more difficult text. Make goes to causal, and mean goes to imply. So when you really break it down, it's really easy to see the difference between the easier text and the academic vocabulary. So I like to use this example to, again, just to make you aware of the choice of words and how we put them together can also impact how well our ELs can access the content or not. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the morphology. I said we were going to come back to this. These morphological trees is something that I learned about in my linguistics class at MTSU. And I think it really helps this awareness factor. So, right, we're talking about teacher language awareness today. And we talked about how English academic vocabulary can be morphologically complex. So let's start with the easy one, trees, up here. So first of all, does anybody know what a morpheme is? Yes?
Yeah, small part of language that has meaning.
Exactly. The smallest meaningful part of a word is a morpheme. So in the word trees, we have 2 morphemes in there. Right? We have tree, that has meaning, and then we have the S. What meaning does the S have in this sense? Makes it a plural, right? We know that automatically, right? Our ELs don't know that, right? If they don't know what a tree is, and you just stick an S on, for all they know, it might be a completely different word. It might, so even just that simple fact of adding 1 letter can completely blow an EL child's mind and prohibit them from gaining access to the instruction. Okay, let's look at realignment. Right? Realignment is a noun, if we think about it. But what are the different parts of that? Well, we have re is one part, and then alignment. Okay, so what meaning does the re have? To do again, right. Okay, then we're stuck with this alignment, right? That's a noun, but we can break that down further into a verb, align, and the suffix ment. What does the suffix ment do to the word? It makes it a noun, right? We know that, right? Maybe our high school science teachers don't realize that, right? So language awareness, right? I want you guys to be aware of the words that you choose, how complex they might be.